The foreman looked her up and down the way a man inspects a lame horse before deciding whether it's worth shooting. "This ain't a charity," he said. She had walked the last 20 miles. The wagon axle had snapped clean at dawn, and she'd left it where it fell, a skeleton of warped wood and rusted iron slowly sinking into the Texas dust. She'd unloaded what she could carry, a canvas bag of clothes, a sack of dried corn, and the saddle. Always the saddle. Her name was Opal. Opal Weller, she told people. A widow. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, soft-handed, kind-eyed, the sort of man who read books in bed and murmured the good lines aloud without meaning to. He had coughed his last into a bloody rag 14 days ago, and the creditors had arrived before the body was cold. They took the house, they took the furniture, they took the silver-handled hairbrush that had been her mother's. They did not take the saddle, because she did not let them. She had left Ohio with $17, a mare named Daisy, and the name of a man she'd heard about from a trail-weary stranger at a roadside inn, a rancher out in the Texas Panhandle named Callaway, who ran a spread so vast it had its own postal address, a man who needed hands and paid fair wages, a man, the stranger had said with some reverence, who didn't care much for excuses, but cared even less for cruelty. She had told herself the lie on the road until it felt like memory. My husband was a cavalry soldier. He taught me everything I know about horses. It was half true. Someone had taught her, just not her husband. Now she stood at the entrance to the Callaway Ranch yard, a sweeping empire of corrals, outbuildings, and a 2-story main house built from dark timber like a fortress that had decided to become a home, and a weathered man with tobacco-stained whiskers was telling her to move on. "Best you see the preacher's wife," the foreman, Jed, said, with a smirk the other hands seemed to find hilarious. "Maybe she needs laundry done." Opal set the saddle on the ground. She rolled her neck once, slowly. "I handle horses," she said. A voice came from the porch of the main house, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that carries without being raised. "What kind of horses?" The man descended the steps, tall, broad through the shoulders, face all harsh angles under the shadow of his hat. But it was the eyes that stopped her, the color of a winter sky before a storm, and they were already working, already cataloging, already halfway through reading a book she hadn't offered him. This is Callaway. He walked past his smirking foreman without a glance and stopped 10 feet from Opal. His gaze moved from her face to the saddle at her feet, just briefly, then back to her eyes. "Any kind," she answered. "The scared ones especially. The ones men have ruined." He said nothing for a moment. Then he turned and gestured toward the far corral, where a gray gelding was currently trying to kill 2 ranch hands. "Handle him," Callaway said. "You've got a job." Right now, wherever you're listening to this, whether you're driving through traffic or lying awake at 3 in the morning, I want you to hold that moment. A woman with nothing but nerve and a dead man's saddle. A man who gave her exactly 1 chance. What I'm about to tell you is the story of what she did with it. Her name before Thomas Weller had been Opal Quinn. Quinn, the same name as her father, Sergeant Thomas Quinn of the 7th Cavalry, a man who could gentle a terrified horse the way some men gentle a frightened child, by getting low, going slow, and never once lying about what you were. She had grown up in her father's world. Not the soldier's world, she had barely known that, but the horseman's world. The world of dawn stalls and hay-sweet air, of reading the angle of an ear or the tension in a jaw the way some people read weather. Her father had the gift, and he had passed it to her the way certain things are passed. Not through teaching exactly, but through years of standing beside someone and watching. He died at Little Bighorn in June of 1876. Opal was 19. She married Thomas Weller the following year. He was gentle and well-read and absolutely hopeless around animals of any kind. He once attempted to brush a neighbor's dog and came home bleeding. But he had loved her fiercely and honestly, and when he died, the grief that hit her was real. Just not the grief anyone expected from the cavalry widow. She was not grieving a soldier. She was grieving a bookkeeper. But a woman traveling alone in 1883 with a cavalry-branded saddle and no male protector was either a thief or a fool, and Opal had no patience for either reputation. So she wove the two Thomases together into a single story. A husband who was both soldier and scholar, who had taught her what she knew, who had left her with nothing but his name and his saddle. It was a lie built from true materials, the worst kind to unpick. In the Callaway corral, the gray gelding, 16 hands of sheer, shrieking panic, had stopped trying to throw the ranch hands and was now simply running in frantic circles, nostrils flared, eyes showing white. He wasn't mean. Opal saw that immediately. Mean horses have a particular stillness right before they strike. This one was only terrified. She slipped between the rails, ignoring the catcalls behind her. She didn't move toward the horse. She moved to the center of the corral and stood still. Then she started to talk. Her voice dropped to the register her father had used. Not the words, never really the words, but the sound. A thread of calm pulled tight through the noise. She talked about water. She talked about green grass and late afternoon shade and the smell of rain coming over a flat horizon. She talked about a world that had no spurs in it. The horse's ears moved toward her, like antennae, like questions. In the summer of 1883, on the Texas Panhandle ranches surrounding what would later become Amarillo, horse-breaking injuries accounted for more than 40% of all ranch hand hospitalizations recorded in the county ledgers of Potter County. Most injuries came not from wild horses, but from the methods used to break them: the spur, the blindfold, the war bridle. The cruelest part wasn't the violence. It was that ranchers called it training. Opal's father had a different word for it. He called it failure of imagination. She took one step. The horse shuddered, but held. Another step. She kept talking. The ranch hands had gone quiet, even Jed. It took 53 minutes by the sun's position, nearly an hour of Opal's voice threading peace into a panicked animal, before she stood close enough to lay her hand on the gray's shoulder, light as a moth landing. A great shuddering breath went through the horse, his head dropped, and the terror simply drained out of him. She led him around the corral by a slack rope, her hand on his neck, speaking softly. When she slipped back through the rails, the yard was silent. Then Callaway's eyes went to the saddle she'd left on the fence post, and something shifted in his face. Something that wasn't admiration, wasn't dismissal, wasn't the cold efficiency of a man making a hiring decision. It was recognition. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "Where did you get this saddle?" Ask yourself this, and I mean really ask it, not the comfortable version. How many times have you built your survival on a story that was mostly true? We call it self-preservation. We call it necessity. But what do we call it the moment someone sees through to the real thing underneath? He gave her the job. He did not press her about the saddle that evening.
He gave her a bunk attached to the back of the main house, barely more than a closet with a cot, but it had a door that latched and a window that faced east toward the corral, and it was the most private space she had occupied in 11 months. Jed showed her to it with a sneer and a warning she didn't bother to absorb. She was too busy learning the shape of her new world.
The Callaway Ranch sat on the eastern edge of the Llano Estacado, where the flatness of the Panhandle gave way to broken caliche land and dry creek beds that ran silver after rain. The sky here was immense, not the friendly sky of Ohio, but a sky with opinions, a sky that reminded you daily how small you were, and somehow made that smallness feel clarifying rather than crushing. Opal rose before dawn. She had always risen before dawn. The horses here were extraordinary. Callaway had an eye. She recognized that immediately. His remuda mixed Spanish Mustang blood with heavier Eastern stock, producing animals that were both tough and responsive. And then there was Shadow, the gray she had gentled on the first day. She went to him every morning before she went anywhere else. He would hear her coming before she reached his paddock, his ears swiveling toward the sound of her boots, and by the time she reached the fence, he would be standing at the rail waiting. Not the frantic, trembling creature she'd first encountered. Under her hands, over the weeks, he became something different. A horse who had learned that calm was possible, that hands could be kind, that the world did not always intend to hurt him. There is a particular kind of patience that frontier women developed, not from sweetness, but from necessity. The understanding that some things cannot be forced open. Locks, wounds, frightened animals, closed men. You had to learn the language of waiting. The other hands watched her from a careful distance. Some of the younger ones began to ask questions, genuine ones. Why she stood at that angle, why she never approached a nervous horse head-on, what she was saying when she made that sound. She answered them plainly, without flourish. She was not performing. She was working. Callaway watched from a distance, too. He was always there, on the porch of the main house in the early mornings, leaning against a corral post in the evenings, a still, dark figure at the edge of her awareness. He never came close. He never initiated conversation. But the weight of his attention was constant, like the pressure of weather coming. She learned his routines the way you learn a landscape, through repetition and attention. He rose at 5. He took his coffee, black and standing, on the porch facing east. He ate alone in his study every meal. Late at night, always past midnight, she heard his boots on the floorboards above her bunk. The slow, heavy pacing of a man being followed by something that lived inside his own head. She recognized the sound. She had made it herself. I believe the loneliest thing in the world is not being alone. It's living alongside someone and understanding, without a word being exchanged, that they are being chased by the same darkness you are. It creates a strange gravity between two people, something like kinship, something more dangerous than that. Her first real test on the ranch came 3 weeks in, not from Callaway, not from Jed, but from a mare named Clara who was foaling badly at 2 in the morning. The foal was Breech. Opal knew it from the sound. She was out of her bunk before the stable boy finished shouting, moving through the dark ranch yard in bare feet, her hair unbound, her mind already running through what her father had taught her in a cold barn in Ohio when she was 14 years old and a mare was dying and the vet was 3 hours away. "You've got small hands, Opal girl," he had said. "That's not a weakness. That's a tool."
Jed was already in the stall, his face red, his temper up, 2 other men pulling at things that should not be pulled. The mare was screaming, not from pain alone, but from the particular terror of an animal that understands something is deeply wrong. "Get out of my way," Opal said. "You've got no business." She pushed past him. She went to the mare's head first, always the head first. She put her hands on the sweating, straining neck and brought her voice down to that frequency, the one that said, "I am here. I know what to do. You are not alone in this." The mare's struggles slowed, not stopped, slowed. "Warm water," Opal said. "Clean cloths, now." One of the younger hands scrambled to obey. Jed stood fuming in the corner. What followed was an hour of the most precise, physical, focused work Opal had done in years. Her hands moving in the dark warmth of the birth canal with a surety that had no room for doubt, repositioning the foal with careful, deliberate pressure, the mare straining and trembling around her, the lamplight throwing wild shadows on the stall walls. When the foal came, it came in a rush, alive, whole, already trying to raise its ridiculous head before it had even figured out it had legs. Opal sat back on her heels, her arms slick to the elbow, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and something that was close to joy. That was when she became aware of Callaway in the doorway. He was watching her, not the foal, not the mare, her. His expression was unreadable in that maddening way he had, but his eyes, those winter sky eyes, were doing something she couldn't quite name. "They would have lost both of them," she said, not looking at him. She ran a cloth over the colt's slick back. A pause. "See that you get a proper meal tonight." That was all. He left. That night, a tray appeared outside her bunk door. Roasted beef, potatoes, a thick slab of cornbread, still hot. She sat on her cot and ate it in the dark, and the tears came without warning. Not grief, not quite happiness, but something raw and tender in between. The sensation of being, for the first time in a very long time, seen. The tack room became the site of the first real conversation. She had stayed late to repair a bridle, a broken cheek strap, simple work but satisfying. The smell of leather and neatsfoot oil a comfort that went bone deep. The lamp hissed. The ranch was quiet. She was entirely at peace. The door opened. She startled, pricked her finger, brought it to her mouth. "Mr. Callaway?" He ignored the title. Came to stand at the workbench, picked up a cracked rein, ran his thumb along it. "There's a memory in old leather," he said. His voice was different here, lower, less controlled. The voice of a man who wasn't performing authority. "The grain holds the years, every soak of sweat, every hour in the sun." My father used to say something like that. The words came out before she could stop them. His eyes went to hers. "Your husband's father?" The cold knot returned to her stomach. "My own. He knew leather." She looked back at her stitching. "Before other things." He didn't press. He pulled up a stool and began working on the old rein with a saddler's tool, his large hands moving with a surprising, careful precision. They worked in silence for almost an hour. The only sounds were the scrape of his tool and the pull of her thread. It was the most intimate Opal had felt since Thomas died. And it wasn't touching, wasn't words. It was the simple, profound fact of being in a small, warm room with another person who was also trying to mend something broken. When she finally stood to leave, he said without looking up,
Opal? First time he had used her name. She paused. The stitches are clean. A beat. You do good work. She walked back to her bunk with her heart making entirely too much noise. In frontier households of the 1880s, the shared workspace was often the most honest place on a ranch. Parlors were for performance, dining rooms were for status, but the tack room, the barn, the cook fire, these were the spaces where people stopped pretending. Historians of the American West largely overlooked this, obsessed as they were with gunfights and land deeds. But look at the diaries of frontier women from 1870 to 1890, and what you find, over and over, is this. The most important conversations happened when both people's hands were busy. He started seeking her out. Not conspicuously. Nothing Callaway did was conspicuous. But with a consistency that had the quality of intention. He would appear in the paddock while she was working with Shadow, ask her opinion on a new filly's temperament, on the quality of the summer hay, on whether the roan gelding's gait was off from a stone bruise or something in the hock. He was asking about horses. She knew he was also asking about her. One afternoon she was treating a foal's leg wound with plantain paste and yarrow tincture, methods her mother had taught her, when he appeared at the paddock fence. "You to stop the bleeding," she said without looking up. "Plantain to draw out the infection. My mother taught me." Silence. "Your mother," he said carefully. "I thought your husband taught you everything." Her hands stilled. She had been sloppy. The web of her lies had too many threads now, and she couldn't keep track of which ones she'd left visible. "A person can have more than one teacher," she said. Her voice came out too tight. She risked a glance. He was watching her with the look she had come to dread, not angry, not accusing, but assembling, like a man sorting pieces on a table, trying to see what picture they made. She looked back down at the foal's leg. Neither of them spoke, but the silence had a new weight to it now. Jed had been watching all of this with the particular focus of a man whose authority is threatened. He had been foreman of the Callaway Ranch for 6 years. He understood horses the way most men on the Panhandle did, through dominance, through the language of control. He was not a bad foreman by the standards of 1883. He got results. He ran a tight yard. He had survived 3 droughts, 1 cattle fever outbreak, and a stampede that had killed 2 men. What he could not survive, apparently, was a woman doing his job better than he did. His campaign against Opal began small. A misplaced currycomb. A latch that had been mysteriously left undone. Her water bucket moved to the far side of the stable yard. Nothing provable, everything deliberate. She fixed what he broke and doubled her vigilance. She did not report it. She had learned early that the most dangerous thing a woman alone could do was give powerful men the impression that she needed protecting. It invited the wrong kind of attention. But Jed was escalating. She could see it in the way his eyes followed her, in the sour curl of his lip when Callaway consulted her about the horses. She had made the unforgivable error of being correct in front of the boss, more than once. "I've known men like Jed in every field, in every century. They are not, at their root, cruel. They are simply terrified. Their status is their architecture, the structure that holds them upright. And when something threatens it, they will tear down anything rather than rebuild themselves. The tragedy isn't what they do to others. It's what they do to themselves." The storm had been building for days, black clouds stacking on the western horizon, the air thickening with that particular electric weight that makes horses nervous and cattle restless. Callaway gave clear orders. Bring the prize stallion, a magnificent black named Midnight, into the main barn before the weather broke. Jed was tasked with it. An hour later, the first drops of rain fell, and a shout went up. Midnight's paddock gate was swinging open. In the chaos of the yard, men scrambling for slickers, someone shouting about the creek rising, Callaway's voice cutting through it all with orders, Opal saw Jed's face. Just for a moment, before he arranged it into an expression of surprised innocence, she saw what lived underneath. He had done it deliberately. Midnight was high-strung at the best of times. In a storm, he would run blind, and the canyons east of the ranch had creek beds that could rise 6 feet in 20 minutes after a cloudburst. Callaway was organizing a search party. The men were mounting up. Opal was already saddling Daisy. She did not wait for permission. She had never been given permission for anything that mattered. She rode out into the wind and the dark, toward the canyons, toward a horse that was going to die if she didn't find him first. The rain came down in full curtains, and the Panhandle darkness pressed in around her lamp. The ground had turned to grease beneath Daisy's hooves. Wind tore at her coat. She found Midnight's tracks in a dry wash, already starting to fill with black water, and followed them into the canyon country east of the ranch. She found him on a spit of caliche land barely 20 feet wide, the creek roaring on 3 sides, rising fast, and Midnight trapped and screaming at the center of it. She was calculating rope angles and trying to figure out how a single woman on a tired mare was going to accomplish what needed to happen when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Callaway pulled up hard, his face a mask of fury and something she would only later identify as fear. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" "Your horse was going to die," she shouted over the wind. "Jed left the gate open, deliberately." A beat. His jaw tightened. But there was no time for that conversation. "The bank's about to go," he said, reading the water with a soldier's eye. "We move now, or we don't move." They worked together without discussion, falling into a natural division that felt, somehow, ancient and familiar. He was strength and positioning. He managed to get a rope over Midnight's head while the stallion threw himself sideways and screamed. She was voice and movement. She used Daisy to herd Midnight from the side, never forcing, always redirecting, her voice cutting through the horse's panic the way her father's voice had once cut through hers. "Get him moving. Give him a direction that isn't into the water. Trust the horse." They got Midnight onto high ground 40 seconds before the spit of land dissolved into the churning brown flood. They stood there in the rain, soaked, shaking with cold and adrenaline, horses blowing hard beside them. Callaway dismounted and walked toward her. His expression was unreadable in the gray light. She braced for anger. Instead, his hands went to the buttons of his heavy wool coat. He unshrugged it from his shoulders and wrapped it around her in one movement. The warmth of it, the smell of him, wool and rain, and something underneath that was just him, enveloping her completely. His hands rested on her shoulders. His grip was firm, steadying. "You could have been killed," he said. His voice was rough in a way she hadn't heard before. Not anger, something rawer than anger. She looked up into his face and saw it clearly, for the first time. Fear. Not the managed fear of a man accustomed to danger. The fear of someone who had been afraid of losing something they hadn't yet admitted they wanted. He was afraid for her. The realization hit her with the force of something falling. On the ride back, their knees brushed in the dark. Neither of them spoke.
The storm had broken, leaving behind a rain-washed world that smelled like the beginning of something. He helped her dismount at the ranch yard, his hands spanning her waist, his touch lasting exactly 1 second longer than necessity required. Neither of them commented on this. Neither of them needed to.
The following morning, Jed was called into Callaway's office. The men in the yard said afterward that they had heard nothing, no shouting, no raised voices, and that this was somehow more frightening than if the walls had been shaken. When Jed emerged 20 minutes later, his face was the color of old ash. He did not speak to Opal that day, or the next, but his hatred had curdled into something uglier, and she could feel it. It was a Saturday when it broke. Callaway had ridden to town. Jed had been drinking since noon. He found Opal in the main barn reshoeing Daisy, and he was carrying 6 years of resentment and a half-empty flask of whiskey and the expression of a man who has decided he has nothing left to lose. He said the things she had been dreading. He said liar and thief. He said no trail widow knows horses like that. It ain't natural. He pulled her father's saddle from the rack and held it up like evidence. "Seventh Cavalry brand," he said loudly for the benefit of the watching hands. "She stole it off some dead man on the trail. She's been lying since the day she walked in." The accusation hung in the barn like smoke. She said, "You don't know anything about me." He said things that should not be repeated. And then Callaway was in the doorway. He had come back early. Nobody heard him arrive. He simply appeared, dark-coated, dust-covered, his face the particular stillness of a man who has already decided what he's going to do and is simply waiting for the conversation to confirm it. "Make her tell the truth," Jed said, thrusting the saddle forward. "Ask her who her husband really was." The barn was absolutely silent. Every eye went to Callaway. Here it was, the moment. He was a man of law and order, a man who had built something real and lasting through discipline and hard truth. If he valued those things, he would demand an accounting. Opal saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, the rational choice rising, the safe choice. She made the decision for him. "He's right," she said. Her voice was hollow. "I should go." She dropped the hoof-pick. She walked out of the barn without looking back. She did not let herself run. She packed in a haze of grief so total it had moved past feeling into a kind of terrible clarity. She folded his coat, the one from the storm, and placed it on the cot beside her note. She couldn't take it. It wasn't hers. She led Daisy out into the moon-pale yard and put her foot in the stirrup. "You're not going anywhere." His voice came out of the shadows by the barn. He stepped into the moonlight, and she saw that his face wasn't angry. It was etched with a pain that mirrored, almost exactly, what she recognized in herself when she looked in still water. "Tell me the truth," he said. "All of it. The saddle. I knew a man who had one just like it, a horsemaster in the 7th. A pause. His name was Quinn. Sergeant Thomas Quinn. The name broke her open. The truth came out in a flood. All of it. The real architecture of her life. Her father's name, her father's saddle, the husband who was a kind clerk from Ohio and not a soldier, the creditors, the flight west, the necessary lie about who had taught her. She wept in a way she hadn't allowed herself to weep in months, not the careful, private grief of a woman who cannot afford to be seen as weak, but the raw, ugly, total kind. When she finished, Callaway was very quiet. "Quinn saved my life," he said at last. His voice had changed entirely, stripped of the commander's authority down to something younger and more broken. "Outside Little Bighorn. A scouting party, ambushed. He pulled me onto his horse, took a bullet that was meant for me." He stopped. "I was the officer who led us into that canyon. Young, arrogant. I got him killed. I've carried that for 10 years.
He understood everything now. Her skill, her patience with frightened animals, her father's saddle worn smooth with his hands, his sweat, his particular way of sitting a horse.
She wasn't a liar. She was a legacy. The sound of drunken laughter crossed the yard, Jed and 2 of his men weaving toward them, flasks in hand. Seeing them together, Jed's face arranged itself into something ugly. "Well, look here." Callaway moved.
No pistol, no raised voice. He simply stepped between Opal and the drunken foreman, and the transformation was immediate and absolute. He was no longer the quiet rancher. He was the cavalry officer, and the difference was as stark as the difference between still water and moving water.
"Jed," he said, quiet, final. "You are fired. You and any man who stands with you. Pack your things and be off my land by sunrise. If I see your face here again, I will have you arrested for trespassing and assault." Jed's courage dissolved. His friends were already backing away. He spat on the ground. He turned. He walked into the darkness. Callaway turned back to Opal. His face was soft in a way she had not yet seen. Sorrow without walls around it, grief held openly rather than controlled. "Your father was the best man I ever knew," he said, his voice thick. "He spoke of his daughter, said she had more horse sense in her little finger than his whole damn troop." Tears streamed down her face. But for the first time in a very long time, they were tears of release. Someone knew her. Not the lie, not the widow, not the grift. The real thing underneath. "He would have liked you," she whispered. Callaway lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture of debt and recognition, and something that was beginning, slowly, to become something else entirely. "Stay," he said. "Let me honor him. Let me help you honor it. Stay." It was not an employment offer. It was a prayer. She looked into the eyes of this broken, careful man who had been carrying a dead soldier's name for 10 years and had just, tonight, had it handed back to him. And she knew. "Yes," she said. The seasons turned. Summer burned into autumn, and the Callaway Ranch moved with a different rhythm. Jed was gone, not spoken of, not mourned the way a bad season passes. The men who stayed worked with a renewed steadiness, the particular ease of people who trust the judgment of whoever's in charge. Opal moved from the backroom bunk to one of the main house's spare rooms, its window looking east over the corral. She put wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. She braided a rug for the floor. Small things. Things that said, "I intend to stay." She and Callaway built the horse breeding program together. Her instinct married to his resources, her patience to his ambition. They transformed the Remuda into something that other ranchers came from 2 counties away to see. Shadow stood at stud by spring. The terrified gray gelding becomes something gentle and powerful, a horse that other horses trusted. Callaway began to talk about the war, about Thomas Quinn, not with the hollow-eyed guilt she'd first seen in him, but with a fond, clear sadness, the grief of a man who has made his peace with loss rather than being devoured by it. She listened. She told him stories of her father, the real ones, the ones she'd kept private because they were precious. The way he smelled of saddle soap and pipe smoke,
the way he sang off-key to frightened horses in the dark. He taught her the stars. She taught him how to laugh again. Really laugh. The helpless kind that has nothing strategic in it. I believe this is what healing actually looks like. Not the dramatic moment of transformation that stories promise, but this. Two people, at the end of a long day, on a porch swing, watching the same sky, learning each other's silences, trusting them. One evening, at the end of summer, they sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set fire to the western horizon. Comfortable silence between them. Her father's saddle hung in a place of honor in the tack room, cleaned and oiled and preserved. Not a relic, not a wound, but a door that had opened and let them both through. He reached over and took her hand, laced his fingers through hers. "I used to sit out here every night alone," he said, not looking at her. His voice was quiet, almost wondering. "I thought I was just watching the sun go down." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes, those winter sky eyes, held a warmth she had never seen in them before. A warmth that was not the distant warmth of competence or approval, but something more like arrival. "I was waiting. I just didn't know what for." Opal leaned her head against his shoulder. The vast Panhandle sky stretched out before them, enormous, indifferent, spectacular. And it looked, she thought, not like a threat anymore. It looked like a promise. She had come west with a dead man's saddle and a lie she'd worn like a second skin, convinced that survival required deception, that the truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. What she had found instead was this. The truth was the only thing that had ever really cost her anything, and it was the only thing that had ever given her anything real in return. Home isn't the four walls around you. Home isn't the land beneath your feet or the name above the door. Home is the person beside you who knows the worst thing about you and chose to stay. Home is the silence that asks nothing of you. Home is the hand that finds yours in the dark, without needing to look. She had been carrying her father's saddle for 1,000 miles, thinking it was the last piece of a life she'd lost. She understood now that she had been carrying it toward something. She was here. Every time I read the messages from people who find these stories, from the Philippines, from Ohio, from somewhere in rural Australia at 2 a.m, from a truck driver outside Amarillo who said he listened 3 times, I'm reminded that the best stories aren't the ones we tell. They're the ones we recognize. You know what it is to carry something heavy for a long time and not be sure anymore whether you're protecting it or it's protecting you. You know what it is to build a life on a story that's mostly true. And maybe, I hope, you know what it is to have someone look at you, the real you underneath the necessary lies, and choose to stay. Tell me, where in the world are you right now, as you're hearing this? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if you're still here, still listening, still believing, the next story is already waiting for you.